Most people see the Biltmore Estate as a fairy tale, the grandest home in America wrapped in mountain mist and Gilded Age glamour, but by the time its doors first opened in 1895, the dream was already cracking. Beneath its 250 rooms lay debts, exhaustion, and one of the largest private labour forces in the South, and inside its towering walls the Vanderbilt family was quietly unraveling. This is the story of how America's biggest mansion survived 130 years of loss, abandonment, and financial freefall, and why the truth was never meant to be seen. In 1888, America was a machine built for money. Railroad empires stretched coast to coast. Steel mills burned day and night. Oil fields pumped black wealth from the earth. And at the top of this economic pyramid sat a handful of families who controlled more capital than entire nations. The Vanderbilts weren't just wealthy, they were a financial dynasty. Cornelius Vanderbilt, the family patriarch, had built an empire from shipping and railroads that made him the richest man in America when he died in 1877. He left behind $105 million. Adjusted for inflation, that's roughly $2.5 billion today. But the real power wasn't in the number, it was in what that fortune could purchase: influence, land, labour, and legacy. His descendants lived accordingly. Cornelius Vanderbilt then built a $7 million mansion covering an entire city block on Fifth Avenue. William Kissam Vanderbilt constructed Marble House in Newport for $11 million just for summer vacations. The family competed in a silent war of architectural excess, each generation trying to outspend the last. But George Washington Vanderbilt II was different. Born in 1862, George was the youngest of William Henry Vanderbilt's 8 children. While his brothers pursued business empires and his sisters married into European nobility, George remained quiet, bookish, reserved. He spoke 8 languages fluently. He collected rare manuscripts. He studied art history and forestry with an intensity that bordered on obsession. He had no interest in running companies. But when his father died in 1885, George inherited $10 million outright, plus substantial trust income. He was 23 years old, and unlike his siblings, he had no obvious purpose for the money, so he went searching for one. In 1888, George travelled to Asheville, North Carolina, visiting his mother who was staying there for health reasons. The mountain town was small, isolated, and economically depressed. But George saw something else. He saw land, cheap, abundant, and stunning. Forested ridges rolling toward the Blue Ridge Mountains, valleys carved by rivers, air so clean it was marketed as medicine. He began buying property. Not a few hundred acres for a vacation cottage, not a modest country estate. George Vanderbilt started acquiring land in quantities that rivaled federal purchases. By 1889, he controlled 125,000 acres. Eventually, the estate would expand to 175,000 acres, roughly 273 square miles. To put that in perspective, that's larger than the entire city of Philadelphia, and he wasn't building a house, he was building a kingdom. George hired Richard Morris Hunt, America's most celebrated architect. Hunt had designed mansions for the Astors and the Belmonts. He'd studied at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. He understood European grandeur, but even Hunt was stunned by George's vision. George wanted a French Renaissance chateau, not an American imitation, a genuine architectural transplant. He wanted limestone shipped from Indiana, oak from the property's own forests, marble imported from Europe. He wanted a banquet hall with a 70-foot ceiling, a library for 10,000 books, a winter garden with a glass roof, guest suites with private bathrooms, a luxury most Americans didn't have. Hunt drew up plans for 175,000 square feet of interior space, 4 acres under one roof. Frederick Law Olmsted, the landscape architect who designed Central Park, was brought in to shape the grounds. Olmsted was initially skeptical. The land was exhausted, overgrazed, overharvested, and eroding. Decades of exploitative agriculture had stripped the soil. But George gave him an unlimited budget and a radical mandate: restore the entire landscape. Olmsted designed a 3-mile approach road through carefully orchestrated forest. He created ornamental gardens, a deer park, and a working agricultural system. He planted over 1 million trees. and critically he convinced George to hire Gifford Pinchot, America's first professional forester, to manage the estate's woodlands scientifically. This wasn't decoration, it was ecosystem engineering. Construction began in 1889, and the scale of labour required was staggering. At the project's peak, over 1,000 workers were on site simultaneously. Stonemasons from Europe, carpenters from across the south. Local labourers desperate for wages. A private railroad spur was built just to transport materials. Brick kilns operated around the clock, producing the 11 million bricks needed for the structure. The mansion rose slowly, methodically. Indiana limestone formed the exterior walls, each block cut to exact specifications. Oak beams, some weighing several tons, were hoisted into place by primitive cranes. Intricate wood carvings were executed by Italian craftsmen who lived on site for years. The whole operation functioned like a military campaign, planned, regimented, and relentless. George visited the site constantly. He reviewed every design decision, every material choice. Every detail mattered because he believed this house would define his legacy. He imagined dinner parties with intellectuals discussing art and science. He imagined a working estate demonstrating modern agricultural methods. He imagined a private library rivaling those of European nobility. He imagined permanence. By 1895, after 6 years of construction, the Biltmore house was complete. The numbers tell part of the story. 250 rooms, 35 bedrooms, 43 bathrooms, 65 fireplaces, 3 kitchens, a bowling alley, an indoor pool. The banquet hall alone could seat 64 guests beneath Flemish tapestries and a pipe organ. The library held 10,000 leather-bound volumes beneath a painted ceiling by the Italian artist Giovanni Antonio Pellegrini. The total cost, approximately $6 million, is roughly $200 million in today's money. And that was just construction. The land, the landscaping, the furnishings, and the art collection added millions more. On Christmas Eve 1895, George officially opened the estate. His mother, his siblings, close friends. They arrived by private rail car and were greeted by liveried servants. They walked through rooms filled with Renoirs and sergeants. They drank French wine from crystal glasses. They marvelled. George had succeeded. He'd built the largest private residence in America, a monument to culture, refinement, and ambition. But the applause was brief, because behind the marble facades and manicured gardens, a darker arithmetic was already at work. The estate required a permanent army of workers just to function. The land drained capital faster than the trust income could replenish it, and George, who'd spent years designing his legacy, had never calculated the cost of maintaining it. The dream was complete, but the machine needed feeding, and it was always hungry. Running the Biltmore Estate wasn't like managing a large home, it was like operating a small city, except the entire burden fell on one family's fortune. The numbers are brutal in their clarity. At any given time, the estate employed between 250 and 400 people, not seasonal workers, not occasional staff, full-time employees who required year-round wages, housing and management. The organisational chart read like a corporate hierarchy: estate manager, head gardener, head forester, head farmer, head engineer. Below them, layers of specialised labour start with the house itself. The indoor staff included butlers, footmen, housekeepers, ladies' maids, laundresses, cooks, kitchen maids, scullery maids, and chambermaids. Each position had defined responsibilities within a rigid class structure. The butler managed the male servants and oversaw formal dining. The housekeeper controlled the female staff and maintained the cleaning schedules. The head chef commanded a kitchen staff of 8. Laundry alone required a dedicated building and 6 full-time workers. Every bedsheet, every tablecloth, every piece of clothing had to be washed by hand, dried, pressed, and returned. In a house with 35 bedrooms and constant guests, the volume was relentless. Then came the grounds. The estate maintained its own blacksmith shop, carpentry shop, electrical plant and fire department. There were stable hands for the horses, dairy workers for the creamery, groundskeepers for the gardens, foresters managing thousands of acres of woodland, farmers working the agricultural operations. The village of Biltmore, located on estate property, housed many of these workers and their families. The estate had built homes, a church, a school, and a hospital. George believed in paternalistic management. Provide for your workers, and they'll provide loyal service. But paternalism costs money, constant money. Consider the operational budget: coal to heat 175,000 square feet during winter, oil for lamps before full electrification, food for family, guests and staff, uniforms, equipment replacement, building maintenance, insurance, property taxes on 175,000 acres. Estimates suggest the estate spent between $250,000 and $400,000 annually on operations, $80 to $12 million in today's dollars, every single year. And that's just to keep the doors open. George had income from his inheritance trusts. But trust income is finite. It generates returns based on invested capital, and the late 19th century saw volatile markets. Railroad stocks, the foundation of Vanderbilt wealth, fluctuated. Dividends weren't guaranteed. And George was spending principal, not just interest. The arithmetic was unsustainable. But George either didn't realize it or didn't care. He focused instead on his ambitious forestry program. Working with Gifford Pinchot and later Carl Schenck, George established America's first school of forestry on the estate. They demonstrated selective logging techniques. They proved that forests could be harvested sustainably while remaining profitable. It was visionary. It influenced national forest policy for decades, but it didn't make money. Not enough money. The forestry operation, the experimental farm, the livestock breeding programs. These were scientific endeavors funded by inheritance, not business models generating revenue. Meanwhile, the estate's isolation created additional problems. Asheville in the 1890s wasn't a wealthy resort town. It was a rural Appalachian community with limited infrastructure. The estate required specialty supplies from New York, Paris, and London. Every chandelier crystal, every bolt of silk, every mechanical part had to be ordered and shipped at enormous expense. And then there was the human cost, hidden behind the operational statistics. The local workers who built and maintained Biltmore came from desperate circumstances. Appalachian families had been displaced by industrial logging companies that stripped the mountains and moved on. Others worked subsistence farms that barely supported survival. The estate offered steady wages, but at the cost of grueling labour. Stable hands worked 12-hour days. Laundresses stood over steaming vats in sweltering rooms. Groundskeepers cleared brush and hauled stones in all weather. The labour was skilled, essential, and exhausting. And while George provided housing and medical care, the power dynamic was absolute. Workers lived in estate-owned homes. Their children attended estate-funded schools. Dismissal meant losing everything. This wasn't slavery, but it was a feudal system dressed in progressive-era rhetoric. The house itself became a strange prison for George and his wife Edith. George married Edith Stuyvesant Dresser in 1898. She was intelligent, cultured, and unprepared for the reality of Biltmore. The banquet hall could seat 64, but most dinners served 3 people in cavernous silence. The guest suite sat empty for months. The library, George's pride, was a monument to solitude. Edith later described the experience as living in a museum where the exhibits include yourself. They had one child, Cornelia, born in 1900. She grew up in 175,000 square feet, with almost no other children. Her playroom was larger than most homes. Her birthday parties required servants to animate the emptiness. The house that George built for legacy became a childhood defined by echoing hallways and watchful staff, and the estate's grandeur attracted the wrong kind of attention. Journalists called it Vanderbilt's folly. Critics questioned the morality of such excess during an era of massive economic inequality. Labour organisers pointed to it as proof of wealth, hoarded while workers starved. The estate became a symbol, not of American achievement, but of American inequality. George responded by retreating further. He stopped hosting large social events. He focused on his books, his art collection, and his forestry programs. He convinced himself the estate was a public good, a demonstration of scientific agriculture and environmental stewardship, but the bills kept coming. By 1900, George had sold 87,000 acres back to the federal government for $5 per acre, a fraction of what he'd paid. The sale formed the core of Pisgah National Forest, and George framed it as environmental philanthropy. In reality, it was financial triage. He needed cash, and the forestry program wasn't generating it. The remaining estate, still nearly 100,000 acres, continued devouring capital, and then came the systemic shocks that would break the Gilded Age entirely. In 1913, the federal government passed the 16th Amendment, legalizing income tax. For the first time in American history, the wealthy faced direct taxation on their earnings. The rate started low, 7% on income over $500,000, but the precedent was set. Suddenly, trust income that had flowed untaxed for decades was subject to federal seizure. Old money families like the Vanderbilts built their fortunes in a tax-free environment. The entire model of dynastic wealth, capital generating returns across generations, assumed that income remained private. The income tax shattered that assumption. George's fortune didn't evaporate overnight, but the trajectory changed. Every year more capital flowed out than flowed in, and there was no mechanism to reverse it. The Biltmore had become exactly what critics claimed, a monument to an economic system that couldn't sustain itself, a private empire draining wealth from the past to maintain an unsustainable present. George must have felt it, the slow tightening of financial walls, the realization that his life's masterpiece was devouring his family's future. But he wouldn't live long enough to face the full crisis. That burden would fall to others. On March 6, 1914, George Vanderbilt died suddenly in Washington, D.C., following complications from an emergency appendectomy. He was 51 years old. His death fractured the estate's already fragile stability. Edith Vanderbilt inherited the Biltmore, all 100,000 remaining acres, the 250-room mansion, the operational infrastructure, and the crushing financial burden. She was 41. Their daughter Cornelia was 13, and neither had been prepared to manage an enterprise this complex. The estate's finances were immediately exposed. George had been spending trust principal for years. The operational cost remained constant, but the income sources were shrinking. The forestry program, the agricultural operations, the livestock breeding, none of it generated enough revenue to cover expenses. Edith faced a brutal choice: liquidate the entire estate or find a way to make it self-sustaining. She chose survival, but survival required transformation. The first step was brutal pragmatism. Edith cut staff. Not gradually, immediately. Positions that George had maintained for appearances were eliminated. Entire departments were consolidated. The estate's workforce dropped from nearly 400 to around 150 within 2 years. The human cost was severe. Workers who'd spent decades in estate service were dismissed. Families living in estate housing had to relocate. The paternalistic system George had built, housing, schools, medical care, collapsed as the economic model failed. Asheville's local economy felt the shock. The estate had been one of the region's largest employers. Now it was contracting. But even with reduced labour costs, the arithmetic didn't work. The house itself was the problem. Heating 175,000 square feet required tons of coal. Maintaining the roof, the plumbing, the electrical systems, the grounds, it all demanded constant investment. And the building generated zero revenue. Then came World War I. The war didn't directly threaten the estate, but it accelerated the collapse of Gilded Age wealth structures. Taxes increased to fund the war effort. Income tax rates climbed from 7% to 77% on the highest earners. Luxury goods became socially unacceptable. Conspicuous consumption was rebranded as unpatriotic. The social contract that allowed families like the Vanderbilts to operate private empires was disintegrating. Old money was now expected to contribute, not just through philanthropy, but through mandatory taxation. Edith responded by closing sections of the house. Guest wings sat empty. Ballrooms gathered dust. She, Cornelia, and a skeleton staff occupied perhaps a quarter of the available space. The rest became a monument to absence. But closing rooms didn't stop deterioration, water damage, pest infestations, structural settling. The house was aging, and without constant maintenance, the decay accelerated. In 1924, Edith made a desperate decision. She sold 87,000 more acres to the federal government for $5 per acre, adding to what would become Pisgah National Forest. The sale raised about $435,000. It bought time, nothing more. The estate now controlled just 12,000 acres, still massive by normal standards, still unsustainable given the operational costs. And then Cornelia became the problem. Cornelia Vanderbilt had grown up in isolation, groomed to be the heiress of a great American estate. But she didn't want that role. She wanted freedom. She wanted to escape the mansion that had defined and confined her childhood. In 1924, she married John Cecil, a British diplomat. The wedding was a massive society event, hundreds of guests, international press coverage. For a moment, the Biltmore returned to its Gilded Age glory. But it was theatre, an expensive performance of a status the family could no longer afford. Cornelia and John lived at the estate briefly. Then they left, first to Europe, then to various postings around the world. Cornelia abandoned her inheritance. She'd later admit she felt suffocated by the expectations and the isolation. Edith was alone again, managing a collapsing empire with dwindling resources. By 1929, the estate was in crisis. The stock market crash that October destroyed what remained of the Vanderbilt fortune. Trust income, already declining, plummeted. The entire economic system that had supported Gilded Age dynasties collapsed. Banks failed, investments evaporated, dividends stopped. Suddenly, families that had considered themselves invulnerable found themselves without liquidity. Edith couldn't sell the house. Who would buy it? What individual or institution wanted a 250-room mansion in rural North Carolina during the Great Depression? The house wasn't an asset. It was a liability that couldn't be offloaded. She couldn't maintain it. Not at previous standards. The staff was reduced to essential functions only. Sections of the house fell into disrepair. The grounds grew wild where Olmsted's gardens once stood, and she couldn't abandon it. The house represented not just George's legacy, but her entire adult life. Walking away meant admitting defeat. It meant acknowledging that the dream had been impossible from the start. So Edith did something radical, something that would have horrified her late husband. In March 1930, she opened the Biltmore Estate to paying visitors. The decision was controversial. Opening a private home to public tours was seen as an admission of financial failure. It transformed the estate from a symbol of exclusive wealth into a commodity. Friends and family considered it undignified. But Edith had run out of options. The house would survive as a business, or it wouldn't survive at all. Tickets cost $1. Visitors could tour the main floor and parts of the grounds. The revenue was modest. A few thousand visitors in the first year, but it was revenue. For the first time in its history, the Biltmore House generated income from its primary asset, itself. The transformation had begun. The private kingdom was becoming a public attraction. But the crisis wasn't over. It was just changing form. The decision to open the Biltmore Estate to tourists in 1930 wasn't a solution. It was a desperate experiment in an era when the rules of wealth had fundamentally changed. The early years of public access were chaotic. The estate had no experience in hospitality or tourism management. There were no gift shops, no restaurants, no structured tour routes. Visitors wandered through rooms where Edith still lived. The boundary between private residence and public attraction was dangerously blurred. And the revenue remained insufficient. A few thousand tourists paying $1 each couldn't cover the operational costs of maintaining 175,000 square feet and 12,000 acres. The estate was still hemorrhaging money. Then came World War II. In 1941, the National Gallery of Art approached Edith with an unusual request. They needed to evacuate Washington's most valuable artworks, including the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, to protect them from potential bombing raids. Could the Biltmore House serve as a secure storage facility? Edith agreed. For 4 years, America's founding documents were hidden in the music room behind locked doors. The arrangement brought no significant income, but it provided purpose. The house wasn't just surviving, it was serving the nation. More importantly, it proved the building's value beyond personal legacy. The Biltmore Estate had become infrastructure, a national asset, not just private property. After the war, tourism began to surge. Americans had disposable income and cars. The interstate highway system was being planned. Leisure travel transformed from elite luxury to middle-class recreation. And the Biltmore Estate, with its European architecture and mountain setting, offered exactly what post-war America craved: accessible grandeur. Edith died in 1958. She'd spent 44 years managing the estate after George's death. 4 decades of financial struggle, constant adaptation, and incremental survival. She never saw the estate become truly profitable, but she'd kept it alive. Cornelia inherited, and promptly transferred ownership to her son, William Cecil. who'd actually shown interest in the estate's future. William Cecil understood something his grandfather and grandmother hadn't fully grasped. The estate wasn't a home anymore, it was a business. And businesses need strategy, not sentiment. In 1960, he moved to Asheville permanently. He studied the tourism industry, he analysed visitor patterns, he calculated revenue per square foot. He approached the estate not as an heir preserving a legacy, but as an entrepreneur managing assets. The transformation accelerated. William added a restaurant, then a gift shop. He opened more rooms for tours. He created seasonal events. Christmas at Biltmore became a major attraction. He invested in professional marketing. He hired hospitality consultants. Critics called it commercialization. William called it survival. In 1971, the estate opened its winery, one of the first in North Carolina. The decision seemed odd. The region had no winemaking tradition, but William understood brand extension. The Biltmore name carried weight. Premium wine fit the estate's image, and the winery created a new revenue stream independent of house tours. The vineyard now produces over 150,000 cases annually. It's one of the most visited wineries in America. The profit margins dwarf tourism revenue per visitor. In 2001, William's company opened the Inn on Biltmore Estate, a 213-room luxury hotel on estate grounds. Rooms start at $400 per night. The hotel operates at near capacity year-round. It generates millions in annual revenue and transforms single-day tourists into multi-day guests who spend money on dining, wine tastings, and additional tours. Today, the Biltmore Estate attracts approximately 1.4 million visitors annually. Ticket prices range from $70 to $90 depending on season. Total annual revenue exceeds $200 million. The estate employs over 2,400 people, more than at any point in George Vanderbilt's lifetime. The house George built to display his wealth now generates substantial profit by displaying itself. But survival through commercialization required sacrifices that George never imagined. The estate is no longer truly private. Tourists photograph the banquet hall where George hosted intimate dinners. They walk through Edith's bedroom. They browse gift shops selling Biltmore-branded merchandise in rooms designed for European artwork. The house has become a stage set where visitors consume a carefully curated version of Gilded Age excess. The remaining family members no longer live in the main house. They occupy private residences elsewhere on the estate, away from public access. The mansion itself exists in a strange temporal suspension, preserved as a museum of the 1890s while functioning as a 21st century business, and the operation is ruthlessly efficient. Every square foot is monetized. Every visitor interaction is optimized for spending. The estate employs revenue management software to adjust ticket prices based on demand. It tracks visitor flow patterns to maximize capacity. It operates like any other hospitality corporation, because that's what it became. The question isn't whether the Biltmore Estate survived. It did. The question is what survived. The building stands, all 175,000 square feet, meticulously maintained by professional preservation teams. The grounds remain stunning, Olmsted's vision kept alive by modern landscape management. The art collection, the furnishings, the architectural details, they're all intact. But the original purpose is gone. George didn't build the Biltmore to be a tourist attraction. He built it as a private refuge for intellectual pursuit and cultural refinement. He built it as a demonstration that American wealth could support European sophistication. He built it for permanence, a dynasty home that would house Vanderbilts for generations. Instead, it's a business, a very successful business, but a business nonetheless. The Vanderbilt dynasty didn't survive. Cornelia's descendants manage the estate as executives, not aristocrats. They don't live in the mansion. They don't host society dinners in the banquet hall. They run a corporation that happens to own a historic house. The irony is brutal and complete. The house built to prove that extreme wealth could create lasting legacy survives only because it became a commodity. The monument to private grandeur endures through public consumption. And perhaps that's the real lesson of the Biltmore Estate. Grandeur, true grandeur at the scale George Vanderbilt imagined, can't be sustained through inheritance alone. It requires systems, economic systems, labour systems, financial systems that can adapt to changing conditions. George built for permanence using 19th century wealth structures. But those structures collapsed. Income taxes, economic crashes, social changes, 2 world wars, the entire framework that supported Gilded Age dynasties disintegrated. What survived was the building, not because it was special, though it was, but because it could transform, because it could serve new purposes, because it could generate value in ways George never intended. The Biltmore Estate proves that grandeur is fragile, that scale demands constant feeding, that the price of magnificence is always higher than the initial cost. But it also proves something George might have appreciated. Adaptation is a form of legacy too. The house endures, changed, commercialized and compromised, but enduring. And every year, 1.4 million people walk through its doors, marveling at a world that doesn't exist anymore. They consume a carefully packaged version of Gilded Age excess, paying for the privilege of glimpsing a dream that was already unsustainable the day it was built. They see the fairy tale, the grandest home in America, wrapped in mountain mist and architectural wonder. But now you know what they don't see: the cost, the labour, the financial freefall, the desperate compromises, the transformation from private empire to public attraction. You know the truth George Vanderbilt never intended anyone to see. The Biltmore Estate survived 130 years of loss and reinvention. But what survived isn't what was built. It's what remains when dreams collide with systems too powerful to resist. The price of grandeur is always paid by someone, somewhere. And the bill never stops coming. The Biltmore Estate stands as a monument to ambition, excess, and survival. But it's just one story in the landscape of American wealth and architecture. What other estates hold hidden histories? What other mansions disguise their costs behind beautiful facades? If you found this deep dive valuable, let me know in the comments which historic property we should investigate next. The Hearst Castle, Newport's Marble House? Drop your suggestions below, and if you want more stories about the systems behind the grandeur, the economics, the labour and the truth behind America's most famous buildings, subscribe and hit the notification bell. This is just the beginning. Thanks for watching. And remember, every monument has a price tag. The question is, who pays it?